My name is Adrian Monck, Head of Public Engagement here at the World Economic Forum. Also, you can probably tell from the accent, British passport holder, hopeful ex-European Union passport holder, still coming to terms with the emotional impact of Brexit. My 12-year-old son burst into tears when my wife told him about it. So we're all still in the aftermath of shock. But that's not what we're going to deal with here. It won't be an emotional kind of bloodbath. It's going to be a cool, rational analysis of what comes next. And to do that, very lucky to be joined by Chairman of the Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, Pundit's Pundit, Larry Stone from BT, who obviously BT, a cornerstone of British business, British industry, just to look at what comes next for them and their business. And from JPMorgan, Michael Falcon, who's going to talk about how the markets are going to look when everything reopens in the morning. So we're going to get things started, and then we're going to probably go in to take some questions from all of you folks. I'm sure there's things you want to ask and get perspective on, and maybe even a few things some of you want to get off your chests. So without further ado, Ian, the Financial Times said this was the most significant thing to happen to the UK since World War II. Is this event sort of being overhyped as the end of globalization, or should we really be very, very afraid of what we've just seen in the UK?
I don't know if I'd say afraid, but I mean, if you think about cycles, the global economy has cycles. Post-war order, every 7 to 8 years, we've had a recession. We understand the boom and bust. Geopolitics has cycles too. We don't pay as much attention to them because they're longer. Last time we experienced the period of geopolitical creative destruction was World War II and the order that emerged from it. What were the risks? And that was a US-led global order. The United States with its allies, standards, values, architecture, you name it. Leaving aside the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is kind of the real outlier, because that wasn't just a risk to the American-led order, but also to the world itself. If you wanted to really look at what were the things that really had the potential to undermine the US-led order globally, sitting here in Tianjin, I would say, you've got the reaction to 9/11, not 9/11 itself, but the overreaction of the United States, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the economic impact, the impact to American power, its predisposition to lead, the alliances that were diminished as a consequence. You'd look at the 2008 financial crisis, and certainly at Davos in 2009, you had the Chinese suddenly thinking, I don't know if this American model actually works anymore. US got through it. And then you'd say Brexit. I mean, I would put it in that context. You're talking about the diminishment of the most important alliance in the post-war order, the transatlantic relationship, which was already before Brexit at its weakest since World War II. You're talking about not only the removal of the UK from the EU, but you're also talking, I think, reasonably likely about the eventual disintegration in further part of the UK itself. And you're also talking at the very least about the severe diminishment of what the European Union actually means, its footprint globally, its common values, and its ability to continue to integrate. So no, I don't think the FT is overhyping it. I think we need to look at this realistically, and it's a good thing that Merkel came out earlier today and said, let's not, try to beat around the bush here. This needs cold, hard, dispassionate analysis so that we have the best possible shot of getting through it.
So in case for those who are not students of British politics, the referendum that took place in the UK, just to prep into Larry, is not a binding decision-making process. The UK is a parliamentary democracy, and Parliament is sovereign. The referendum under the Referendums Act is an advisory referendum, which gives people, if you like, it's a massive opinion poll, which is extremely hard for a parliament to ignore. But obviously, if there's a new general election and a new parliament, that parliament has a new mandate, and that mandate could include reversing decision taken under an old parliament, because that's what politics does and that's how politics happens. But if that doesn't happen, or whatever happens, you've got to carry on running businesses like BT in the UK. What does it mean for your in the immediate term, when you're getting back into the office Monday, Tuesday, thinking about how to plan for the next year, for the next 6 months, for the next month, and about your workforce and about BT's immediate future and companies like BT?
Sure, well, it's a delight to be here. I always wanted to spend Sunday in China talking about Brexit. That's why I'm wearing I managed to find a black suit for the day, but no black tie, unfortunately. How to start really? Well, BT is in all EU 28. We have quite a substantial, about 10 to 12% of our global revenues derive from the EU 27. And of course, the relationship between the UK and the EU is fundamental to our business. As a company, we were very firmly in favour of staying in the European Union. We said so publicly. Our chairman was co-treasurer of Stronger In. Our unions were also in favour, our two main unions, of staying in. But ultimately, the British people took a different view. I mean, why we wanted to remain was economic stability, because we felt, as points made before, that were we to vote in a different direction, then there would be a period of significant economic instability, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. But obviously Friday wasn't wonderful. Our share price fell over 10%, for example. And secondly, we rely very strongly on a single market of 500 million people in the European Union, where we get similar conditions around access to markets, movement of people. And we've been building a very strong business there. And we also rely, to a good extent, on the European Union in terms of its heft in global trade negotiations, whether it's TTIP or TISA or EU-Japan, or potentially in the future, after the investment agreement, EU-China. And each of those, for example, in our sector has an ICT and the e-commerce chapter, and the British government has been denuded of trade specialists over the last 30 or 40 years. So that's an interesting picture for us. So what does it mean for us as a company? Well, I think the issue for us is one of instability and uncertainty, and businesses, wherever they are, don't like instability or uncertainty for investment or jobs. We're a very strong business. I think we'll be a very strong business throughout this period, but it's going to be, I suspect, quite turbulent. Just to take sort of three levels of instability. One is where the market's going on, the strength of the pound, the impact on other currencies, hedging strategies for companies, the range of things one might expect. The second level, I think, is, well, what will happen in the UK? A vast majority of members of the UK Parliament did not want Brexit. The UK population did want Brexit, though there was some arguments about what they were individually voting for within that. So we're going to have a leadership election in the Conservative Party, possibly a leadership election in the Labour Party. In parallel, we're going to have to negotiate a new relationship with the European Union, and possibly new relationships with others at a time when we have a relatively limited capacity within the civil service to do so. I think that's two levels of uncertainty. And the third one, and I'll stop talking then, is just what it means for the United Kingdom. There's a point which I often look to J.K. Rowling for my political input. But she made, I think, a couple of days ago, say, well, this could mean the end of two unions, the UK's relationship with the European Union and Scotland's relationship with the UK. So I think it's a turbulent time. Businesses will survive and I'm sure prosper. I chair our risk committee, and I was rather hoping this would be read the FT and comment on geopolitical matters happening a long way from the UK. But all the political risk geopolitically for us now is at home.
Michael, JPMorgan, 16,000 people, I think, based in London. Huge part of the 1.3 million strong City of London financial services business. You just talked, by the way, Larry, about the vote, and 36% of eligible voters actually voted for leave. So that's just over a third of the British public who could have voted, turning out for something that could have profound, and already has had profound, destabilizing effects on their country. Do you think, Michael, the Angela Merkel appeal for cool heads, the weekend, some calm, how do you think the markets are going to respond to this next week? Are they going to stay panicked, or are they going to say, hang on a second, people are going to sort this out. This isn't going to be the great unraveling that we might have thought it will be?
Well, I do think the markets, first, thank you for having me and for the opportunity to sit on the panel. I do think the markets over the weekend already and on Monday when markets open in Asia and follow around the world will be focused on what happens next. How do we digest this? And there's already a lot of political speculation, if you will. Not economic news, but political news or speculation out of Europe as to fast or slow. What does this mean? But I think it's important that we put this in context. We view this now as a shock and a surprise, but not a crisis. Markets, as volatile as they were on Friday, functioned well. Markets functioning meaning there was adequate liquidity, there was good price discovery. I mean, things were working. Dramatic drops in UK share prices, in the pound to at one point 30-year lows. And all of this could be expected and understood, even though not predicted, because the market consensus was a Remain vote. I think we're going to see, as we move into this week and even weeks beyond, more volatility as the speculation ebbs and flows, as the path becomes more clear or at times perhaps less certain, whether that's rumors spreading or failed attempts to change or moderate course. People's emotions can rise or fall. I think, though, a couple of things that would put this in perspective. One is, to the point Larry makes, I mean, the UK is a very dynamic and strong economy with a long history, with a lot of capabilities relative to innovation, resource, technology, global reach, lots of British citizens around the world participating in not just business, but in government and academic and scientific endeavor. And so there's a very global and market-oriented culture there that's going to continue to be strong. Secondly is in the context, this will be bad for the UK in the short term economically. Longer term, though, that will recover too. And then I think the impact circles out from there. There'll be more impact to Europe and maybe less globally. But we're not at this point calling for recession in the UK, though we see growth moderating. We see inflation picking up as a result of the weaker pound. But we don't see this derailing global recovery at this point. It's more contained. It is, as we say, in a shock, not a crisis at this point. And so far, markets seem to be handling it reasonably well.
Before I go out and take a few questions from folks, there are people who'd say, look, this vote is very easy to understand. It's a slap in the face to people like everyone in this room, to elites. It's a slap in the face. We talk about inequality and inclusive growth in Davos and at meetings like this, and yet people on the ground in communities like the one I grew up in, for example, don't see it. They don't feel it. They can't reach out and touch those improvements. To what extent should we be worried that actually it's the system that we're part of that's helped deliver this shock to itself, if you like? It's self-administered. We haven't put through the kind of policies and measures that might have mitigated against this.
Well, I think it's that and one other thing. So the notion that globalization, which of course is something that the WEF is at the vanguard of, has bolstered two groups globally, the top 1% and particularly the top 0.001%, and also the global middle class, the true middle class, not the middle class in the US or the UK, which is quite wealthy in global context. And in between those two poles, you've had a hollowing out. And there's no question that elites in every manifestation, political leaders, government leaders, corporate leaders, NGO leaders, billionaires, have watched the social fabric fall apart for the middle classes in those advanced industrial democracies and not responded adequately to it. And let's face it, when you are faced with I can't get these people to pay attention to me. The system is broken for me and people like me. Don't tell me that this is going to be good or bad. I need to deliver a shock because otherwise they will continue to act in this way. In other words, I don't think it's an absence of fact. I don't think it's uneducated people. This is rational behavior. In the same way that someone in Gaza who has no ability to act out, has only Iraq, is going to throw it. because it's asymmetric, or Panama Papers, someone is going to take that data and just put it out there. This is the same sort of behavior. It's very rational, just comes from a different context, different value perspective. But the second point, and you're seeing that across the entire developed world, you see it in the United States as well. But the second point is different. The second point is identity politics, right? White people voted one way in this election, and Asians and blacks voted the other. And there was a very strong anti-immigration push here. And that was not just about jobs, it was about other. It's the fact that particularly in Europe, the ability to integrate and the willingness to integrate other is really not a part of nationalism very well. And that, I think, is all, that's not something that you're going to put the blame on the top 1% for. That's a much deeper structural issue. The good news is in the United States, that group is dying off. Younger people are secular. They are much more multicultural in orientation. They like immigrants. They're also much more multicultural in fact. They're much more socially liberal on gay rights, on drug legalization, on anything. In Europe, that's not necessarily the case, particularly with the refugee crisis. And so I absolutely have a different take on the second component. It's a reason why I'm not as concerned about, say, Trump and Trumpism, which is at its highest levels now, and I'm much more concerned about a further unwind with greater right-wing populism, extremism generally across the continent and in the UK.
Larry, I mean, you know, BT has corporate social responsibility programs. It takes all these issues seriously. It's staffed by well-meaning people. Should it have done more to recognize what was going on in one of its core
I think, you know, collectively, well, I mean, there's been a, you know, a lot of people talk about a breakdown in trust in a range of people you used to trust. You used to trust your financial sector, you used to trust your politicians, you know, you used to trust business leaders, and that seems to have diminished. I mean, who do people trust now? I mean, probably like the army, to some extent. That's probably about it. So there's, you know, some religious leaders. So I think there's a bit of a perfect storm here. You had that sort of background which had been sort of germinating for some time. You then had sort of immigration issues in probably three dimensions. One was within Europe. The other was economic migration from outside Europe. And then there was refugee, all of which was to some extent conflated. And there's also a sort of very effective, if one wants to put it that way, dialogue by some of those in the campaign to, how should one put it, to de-expert the experts. You know, there's this constant thing about, well, the OECD would say that you know, the EC would say that, the IMF would say that. So every time an expert or the British Treasury would say that, came out with something, it was very quickly poo-pooed as a sort of Twitter speed soundbite without any necessary feeling there was a need to put forward some form of countermanding strategy or statement. Just trade, for example, you know, we have a trade architecture, which the UK is part of in Europe. And one would have thought that the Out campaign would have said what their strategy was, or would have to say what their strategy was for relationships going forward. But it was variously EEA, which would be the Norway model, which would actually be slightly less good than the current circumstances, Canada, Albania, Serbia, WTO. So it was, what was it?
Anyone from Albania and Serbia here, don't be...
You know, well, I mean, it's not saying there's anything wrong with the countries, just the nature of the trading relationships are quite, you know, complicated. So there's all these sort of things, and people were trying to sort of, well, how do I vote, you know, in this context? And I think there wasn't a great deal of particularly objective information available for people on which to make a balanced judgment, because you had basically worry about the economy versus worry about immigration, and there was as I say, it became you know, something of a less than elegant battle.
And Michael, you know, you're part of the financial services industry. Some people in the UK characterise this as, you know, the people versus the City of London. You know, a popular kick in the teeth to the financial services industry, which has brought so much wealth and prosperity to London, but also people perceive it to be prosperity that stayed inside the M25 inside the circular ring road that runs around the capital. Is that something you feel you can relate to? Or?
It's a common criticism, and I don't think it's limited to the City of London. I think we see it globally, and I think we've seen it over the course of centuries, the role that bankers or capital market players play. We also see the value of it, and we see capital market ideas and reformation taking positive impact, including the way that our host country here is trying to use mechanisms to reallocate capital and become more efficient relative to what gets funded and what gets defunded, if you will. So I don't think we look at this, the Brexit vote, as a referendum on the financial service industry in its sole dimension. I think it is to the point of Ian that Ian makes. It is a reflection of some larger trends. We would tend to view these political. First of all, the political stability within Europe is still relatively high, even though we don't know what Europe means now within these countries, including in the UK. There are strong institutions that work and can govern. It is, around the world, a wake-up call to political leaders or people, the elites, if you want to call it that, throughout society, relative to the voice of significant portions of the population. Our belief is that people are going to react to that. It's not static. It's not, okay, well, what if we don't do anything? The pressure will be to reform and make changes. And we already see, I think, parts of that in policy reflected around the world. And I think we could expect to see more of it in the months and years to come.
Just going to turn it over. We've got 10 minutes. Turn it over maybe to the room here and get a sense from folks here of their questions and maybe quick thoughts too, because I'm sure we'll have a few hands in the air. So if we want to, do you want to see? Okay, can I get to gentleman at the back and gentleman over there, and if we can just introduce ourselves before we.
Hi, I'm Brad Staples. I've lived and worked in Brussels for 10 years as a Brit and been out in the continent for 22 years. I come from a certain perspective on these issues. We've had a petition that now has 2.5 million votes calling into question the validity of the referendum outcome. We've got Parliament having the ability to act on or not, or take an adjusted position when it meets in the course of this week. Is there any way back from where we are? Is there an adjusted position, a more rational outcome, or are we headlong into true Brexit?
Gentleman just over there.
Thank you. Jonathan Beard from Arcadis, lived in Hong Kong for 16 years, but obviously used to live in the UK. The question is about what comes next. Do you see the response from the European Union as further integration? On the lines of the Brits were never really in this anyway, we stick with the same model. ECB taking further control perhaps? Or do you think this will lead to reform within the European Union and a certain reflection on change, the direction that it's been going away from further deepening and some loosening of the controls?
So, taking Brad's point first, is there a cunning plan to find a way out of this? Does anyone have an inclination that this could be a very nasty scare and Britain can pause and come up with what in Blackadder, which is a British TV series, they used to say a cunning plan to escape?
I'll have a quick go. There haven't been many cunning plans actually in this context in the last few weeks. I think it would be very difficult actually, because you've got I think it's about 2.8 million now, because I'm getting addicted to watching this tick up every few minutes and where it's coming from in the country. But you're right, it's a very interesting dynamic. About 450 of the MPs in the British Parliament, which is about 2/3, are not in favour of Brexit at all. I think what it would come into play is it would be very difficult in relation to the will of the people not to leave the European Union, but it may have an important dynamic to play in the context of what the enduring relationship between the UK and the European Union is. So if we wanted full single market access, then we'd have to go down an EEA model, which is a la Norway or Iceland or Liechtenstein, which includes obviously full access to the single market, full movement of people. You pay a lot into the budget and you don't get much chance, or you don't talk at the Council of Ministers and its various guises in Brussels. So it's, for the Brexiteers, it'd be slightly worse On the other hand, it will give you full single market access. So I think that dynamic will play out quite significantly in the British Parliament, but I personally don't see it being as cunning as you might wish.
Ian, is there
I was
a
going to link it to the next question.
Yep.
Is that all right? Because, I mean, look, so no one's really said anything favorable so far, including myself, for the exit, folks. Let me try. The EU is a mess. It is not giving anyone confidence. For the last consistently 7 years at the World Economic Forum, we have complained in every manifestation about how the only way they resolve anything is to kick the can down the road. And finally, one member has said they're going to rip the Band-Aid off. They're going to stop kicking the can. Now, I know that's not why they voted for it, and I know that the people that are most annoyed in that regard with the EU are actually the people that aren't going to make the UK into Singapore, right? I get it. But at the same time, there is an argument to be made that over the next 5-10 years, that if the UK had stayed in, what they were staying in was going to become more unwieldy, more problematic, and more challenging. So let's just recognize that for a second. And in that context, let's now understand what's likely to happen. This is going to be a mess, right? Because the politics, at least for the Greece crisis, the politics played in favor of keeping the Greeks in. I mean, making them suffer, but ultimately keeping them in. The politics here, absolutely not. I mean, if you're in an establishment party in the EU with strong populism from the Five-Star Movement to the Swedish Democrats to Podemos to the National Front to the Alternatives for Deutschland to the Freedom Party to, you know, every single one of these countries have them, right? You've got to keep these people down. You're not going to suddenly bring them into the fold, which means you've got to make this challenging for the Brits. You got to demand, we want fast answers, while the Brits are like, well, let's hold off. We got to, you know, the parliament, we got to vote, we got to think what we want, we got to hire people at no trade. That's a problem. And then you also have the East Europeans with a lot of leverage, right? Because what they're going to do is they're going to say, oh, you want us to be supportive of this process? Well, let's get some concessions. Let's get some goodies for ourselves. This is not, the EU, unfortunately, is not presently on a road that is replete with strong leadership. Even in places where the leadership is good and more strategic, like Renzi in Italy, certainly like Merkel in Germany, they're increasingly besieged and limited domestically by electoral cycles and by demographics that are challenging. So again, when you asked at the beginning, how big a risk is this? The reason it's such a big risk is not because of Brexit. It's such a big risk because of the context in which Brexit occurs. If this had happened 10 years ago, I'd be fairly sanguine. I'm not even sure we'd need this panel. In this context, we need it.
Michael, just to pick up on that, you talked about Britain and its prospects, but Europe got hit pretty badly. European markets got hit pretty badly on Friday. How do you see the European dimension playing out? Is it a bigger risk to the continent than it is to the island nation?
So again, and I think Ian presents the volatility argument quite well, and we're going to see uncertainty. Markets don't like that, and so things will be more volatile. And you saw it the same way you saw it through sell-off in UK equities, you saw it through sell-off in European equities as well, because that's where half of the trade from the UK is going, right? Half of the goods and services are sold on the continent. The connections to the US and to global markets are much lower. Certainly Europe is a larger portion, but even, I was talking to our chief market strategist for the region, the country with the highest percentage of trade dependency in a relationship with the UK is Singapore, and that's still single digit. So we're not talking about massive dependency directly into the UK. I think what you have, though, is an idea of interdependency of markets and the ability for markets to react and absorb this over time. And in the short term, these shocks or speculations will not be quieting, but over the long term, if parts of Europe can be refigured and understood, there can be a gradual return to normal.
So is this going to be the event that triggers Europe to reform itself and make those kind of fundamental reforms that people, the Brexiteers have demanded for so long?
I think over the long term, this is an event that can get you to a two-track Europe. This is an event that can force a European core because more broadly, single digital market and, common financial reforms and, sort of big technology projects, those are going to get more and more impossible in a 27-country union. But there are countries that will continue to see utility in a broader space. But I think we have a very long way to go, unfortunately, before we get to the point where we can start to rebuild.
Yeah,
Sorry, I would add one other point to this discussion, which is, when we talk about the massive amount of work in terms of renegotiating trade deals, not just with the EU, but with other partners around the world, lack of trade expert resources, a lot of the infrastructure to do this has been dismantled. But it's important to understand, too, that there's an underlying demand for this interconnectivity, and there are models now, right? So even if the path of Brexit is less integrated to Europe than perhaps the things that look worse than remain for the Brexit folks, there are models. It's not starting from scratch, and there is an underlying basis of economic activity that is strong that will be the catalyst for that. People will be looking to put those agreements in place, and there is a starting point, or a straw man, if you will, for most of those agreements.
And Larry, I mean, the Brexiteers would say, well, look, the EU was a great 1960s, 1970s solution. You needed big buildings and Berlaymont, but actually now we can do all this stuff in a networked fashion. We don't need all those big kind of bureaucracies to help us.
Well, I think.
Do you buy any of that?
It's a rational argument. I think.
That's isn't it?
No, but I think there's a couple of things really. One is, I think, there's some nascent trends, I think, in the deal which David Cameron struck with the European Union, trying to look at some of the issues which Ian was mentioning about better regulation, less regulation, free trade agreements, the Eurozone versus non-Eurozone, the in and out. So there's an attempt to sort of at least a bi-speed Europe as part of that. That was something he was trying to ease towards. And then you got I think the other thing which strikes me is a lot of the issues which the European Union are wrestling with, and the UN and others, is basically issues which transcend boundaries, whether it's trade or whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's climate change. There are things which need these sort of large clusters of nations to talk to each other in a reasonably sort of coherent fashion. So I think there's that countervailing trend as well.
Let's go back and see if we have some more points of view in the room. Gentleman just down there on the end.
Thank you. Manny Ryback, Switzerland. Question maybe for Mr. Bremmer or for the audience, in fact. Given that we're in China, what are sort of the views of China onto this from a geopolitical point of view?
Constructive. I think in the same way that we've seen the Chinese prefer Hillary Clinton, who they see as a hawk and problematic, to Donald Trump, who they see as unpredictable, the Chinese also prefer a stronger continued union than they would prefer this level of instability. And I put that in marked contrast with Mr. Putin, who wants a divide and conquer strategy. He sees the world through a geopolitical, a geostrategic lens, much more zero-sum. The Chinese are becoming more of a status quo player. They're politically more stable. They're less insecure. They're more confident. They're thinking longer term. If there's anything that's a positive that I take away from all of this, it's the way that the Chinese have been reacting to it.
Interesting. And China, though, traditionally in Europe likes to strike bilateral deals. It doesn't like to go and deal with Brussels. It likes to visit individual capitals. So
that's right.
Is this going to be such a huge change for them in terms of how they deal with the European establishment?
No, I don't think it's that. I just think that, the same thing can be said about Trump. If Trump becomes president, the Chinese will absolutely have lots of ability to pick off, sort of countries that have been wavering about their relationship with the United States. The Chinese can actually gain ground, but they don't want the grave level of instability. And I think what they would see here is weaker growth impacts China as a global economic power. More uncertainty about what Europe is going to look like, more distractions, harder for the Chinese to come in and do good long-term deals. I mean, definitely they would be able, you could say they can more capably play one European country off of the other, but you could do that in the old EU anyway. Think about Germany and the solar deals, for example. I mean, it wasn't as if the EU was ever manifesting itself as a solid, coherent bloc against the Chinese. I don't think that was the game.
Any Chinese politicians in the room who'd like to come in on what it means in terms of the Chinese perspective? Or is a diplomatic silence being maintained? I have to say, I can share last night, had dinner with a couple of friends who are Chinese from the Chinese media, and they said that it had been reported obsessively on Chinese media, and it had been given great coverage, despite, as one of them said, it was like watching paint dry. But it certainly hasn't been an advertisement for what perhaps we like to imagine Western democracy as being good at. Can we get the microphones out and just get a sense of folks having more questions for the panel? I've got a couple of questions I want to put to them myself. Gentleman just on the corner.
Thank you. Tony Juniper, environmentalist from the UK. I was very actively involved in the campaign for remaining inside the European Union and watched this unfold over the last few weeks. And evidently, the whole thing was about pure politics in the end. The policy issues were nowhere really to be seen. And as a result of all of that's happened, we've now got a political crisis on our hands, I think. And any solution that's going to have to come is going to have to come through some kind of political view being established. And the difficulty we've got now is that the Conservative Party, which was split on this to begin with, which is why we had the referendum in the first place, is now searching for a new leader, raising all sorts of questions about who that can be and what kind of view they could possibly take on all of this, especially given that one of the front runners, Boris Johnson, appears to have made a mistake and got involved in the wrong side of the campaign. He didn't actually mean for us to leave, it seems, but we have done, as a result of him trying to advance his political ambitions. So there's all sorts of terrible messes inside the Conservative Party as a result of that and other things. And then on the opposition side, you have Jeremy Corbyn, who didn't look like an enthusiastic Remainer, even though that was the position of his party. And as a result of him not leading his grassroots, a lot of the people who wanted out were in fact Labour Party supporters. And so he's now looking for a no-confidence vote coming at him tomorrow or during the week. So how we get any kind of stability back into British politics seems to me to be really quite a big question right now. And I pay quite close attention, and I don't know if I could name anybody who could be a Prime Minister who has the ability to get us out of this mess in any kind of orderly way. If you've got any advice from the panel, I'd love to hear it.
It's very good. That's a tough ask for the next UK Prime Minister. I should say, following it obsessively as I did, there were a couple of good lines that came out on the politics of it. One was that Jeremy Corbyn embraced the Remain campaign with all the wholeheartedness of someone making a hostage video, and the other was that Boris Johnson had put millions of jobs into play to gain one. Which may or may not be the case, given how things unfold. Do the panel see any political, hero or heroine waiting in the wings to help solve Britain's emerging political crisis?
Well, I'd like to pass this hospital
It's
to JPMorgan.
way out of my zone of expertise.
Okay, then I'll
Ian, you'll step forward. I know you're not a man
Well,
to,
no, I mean, just one is that, it's not clear to me at all that Boris Johnson's the next PM. And we were actually chatting about this a little beforehand, that Theresa May, again, on the other side of the campaign, but someone who folks have respect for, and I think at least the pundits, the betting pools actually think she has decent odds at this point, and I think would be much more of a technocratic, capable face for Britain. I also think that as much as you've got Sturgeon in charge of the Scottish National Party saying, we're going to have a referendum, it's very likely, wait and see is going to play out here. The Brits, you can't force them to have this vote. They can take their time before to use Article 50, that would be the formal exit clause. They can take their time, wait until they have a government in place for that, no matter what the Germans and the French say. The same is true for the Scots. And if I were the Scots at this point, I would be thinking about, leveraging you just threw us out of Europe. We now want a seat at the table, Westminster, in your negotiations. We want to argue for a more constructive union. We want a Norway path. So that at least then, if it doesn't happen or when it doesn't happen, the SNP is in a much stronger position domestically to have their referendum, run the damn place, and ensure that they win by a big margin. Right now, if they had it, it's low energy prices. The Scots did not turn out in large numbers for the Remain camp. Not clear that the SNP is a slam dunk there. So I do think we have time. I don't know if that's necessarily, saying that we're going to have great unity, but time is not the worst of things. I mean, a few collective deep breaths here, as opposed to everyone saying we need a solution right now. At least that's something the Europeans are good at.
So for those who don't follow British politics too closely, Theresa May is described as a sort of Angela Merkel of potentially of the UK. So she has that kind of reputation for solidity and one hopes to good statesman-like sense. We're going to draw to a close in a few minutes. I just wanted to pitch in something from my particular perspective, being British and obviously having just stopped sobbing into my tea, which is, if you want to know something about the campaign, look at the two places at the opposite ends of the argument. So one of the most Remain places in Britain. What were the characteristics of that place? Well, one of them was the London borough of Lambeth. White British population of the London borough of Lambeth, 39%. That's it. Education level of that borough, 45%. People hold a degree or a degree equivalent, so it's educated. Population over 65, 8% of the population. Lastly, deprivation. Out of 330 local authorities across Britain, it's the 29th most deprived local authority. So there's a lot of hardship, a lot of poverty in Lambeth. But if you look at what it's got going for it and why it came out in the 70% bracket for Remain, it's diversity, education, and youth. Okay? And I'll tell you about the place I grew up in, which is Great Yarmouth, which was probably, I think, actually won on the night as the most leave place in Britain. Now, Great Yarmouth has 92% of the population identifying as white British. Less than 1 in 5 of the people there have a degree or its equivalent. 25% of the people are over the age of 65. And, you know, it lacks, and on deprivation, by the way, it beats Lambeth. It's 20th out of 330. So it's got the same issues in poverty and deprivation, but it's got a very different profile of its people. Now, all this is to say that the difference between anger and acquiescence can sometimes be as simple as education, opportunity, and diversity. None of these things are miracles. They're all things that policy can achieve, but they're certainly things that weren't incentivized under the British political system, because over 50 years, Great Yarmouth hasn't changed at all. And I can tell you that because I had to go back there last year for a family event, and I visited the house I was born in. And the house has not changed one bit. It has plastic windows instead of metal, has a gas fire instead of a coal fire. That's 50 years of economic progress in one town. So some of these issues are not just issues that the UK faces, they're issues of the Rust Belt in the US, they're issues too that I'm sure resonate with folks in China about the transition and stuff that's going on. There are issues that are happening in places like Japan. These are global issues. And I think one of the things that we need to draw from this, potentially all of us, is to say, you know, we need to go from talking about inclusivity, talking about some of these things, to actually figuring out how we incentivize them, how we make ourselves do what we say we'd like to do. And that's not something I think, and I'll speak here, I'm not speaking for the World Economic Forum, I'm speaking for myself, I don't think any of us been good at doing. So on that slightly gloomy note, I can add one slightly optimistic note, which is to say, if you look at where some of those manifestations, some of those shocks happened politically in Britain in the last 40 years, go to Toxteth, where there were riots. Look at poll tax day, where there were riots. Look at Brixton, where there were riots. You know, there's a history of social change and anger manifesting itself in disorder, in violence, and in destruction. And for the first time, maybe, in a sign of progress, we've seen anger manifesting itself through the ballot box. And perhaps that's what progress looks like. So however sad we feel about change, better to see a change that takes place with someone writing an X in a box than through smashing a McDonald's window and setting fire to a car. So that's my claim to optimism. I want to thank all of our panelists on your behalf. Thank you for joining us. I hope in the coming weeks and months that we see a more settled and happier environment than the last week. Thank you all.